So, it has been quite a journey for this channel to sort through dozens of AMD code names and console documents over the past month, and I want to thank you all for bearing with me as I issued correction after correction in video after video as more evidence was sent to me by my sources that further clarified, well, a lot of things after I had already started reporting on them. Sometimes that's just how it works in this game. I report something, a source sees the video, goes, let me double check that, or another source that I hadn't reached out to sends me something that another source didn't. That's just, it happens sometimes. But at this point, everything is cleared up. I even tweeted out the final situation of the codenames recently just to set the record straight. And in summary, I said that Magnus is the next-gen Xbox that has 11 Zen 6 cores and 68 compute units. And because it has Zen 6, which launches next year, and only 8 more compute units in the PS5 Pro, we concluded that this thing is probably coming out fairly soon, as in to say probably 2027, and it's not going to be insanely more powerful than the PS5 Pro. When you factor in ray tracing, it'll be a lot stronger, I'm sure, but you know, it's not going to be like the uplift that you saw from the PS4 Pro to the Xbox Series X. It will be a lot stronger. It will have easier ability to do high refresh rates compared to the current gen consoles, and it will have newer features. But again, I don't think it's going to quite be the difference that we saw from PS4 Pro to Xbox Series X. All right, moving on then. I also confirmed in that tweet that Orion is the PlayStation 6 and Canis is the PlayStation 6 handheld. Yes, a PS6 handheld, 100% confirmed. And you see, at first, Orion and Canis, how did this happen, right? They were just a couple of a dozen codenames I had recently gotten access to, and that's all I could confirm until very recently was that they're semi-custom APUs. They could be for any console manufacturer or even maybe someone else, and I didn't really know what to do with them compared to the other codenames. Actually, to give you an example of just how many APU codenames I'm aware of, this one's fun because I actually did see in some documents what it was. There was a Zen 4 variant of the Steam Deck OLED APU. I believe that one is called Sephiroth, and it just turned out to eventually what they went with was a 6nm die shrink of the 7nm APU that was in the original Steam Deck. No joke. I saw something that mentioned Zen 4 in a different variant. Apparently, Valve and AMD considered making the Steam Deck OLED quite a bit stronger than the initial Steam Deck. Not massively, but probably 50% faster. But at the end of the day, Valve said, this is a console, a true console, and we're going to keep roughly the same hardware specs for an entire generation. But I thought it might be fun for you guys to know that Valve did consider going to Zen 4 with the Steam Deck OLED. So, though, if I did have all of these code names, how did I eventually conclude that Orion and Canis were PlayStation? Well, I'll tell you how. Eventually, a source sent me full documentation on Orion and Canis that had clearly called out these things. That they were Sony consoles, that they needed to have PS5 and PS4 backwards compatibility. Sorry, no mention of PS3, by the way. And that they planned to utilize RDNA 5. So, yes, I'm about to tell you the performance and specs Sony was targeting when they signed the PlayStation 6 deal with AMD years ago. But first, I do want to clearly call out something in those documents that regards RDNA 5, because this is something just PC gamers in general might be interested in. I know the IPC increase. And just to be clear, when I say IPC for RDNA 5, what I'm talking about is if you had the exact same amount of compute units of RDNA 4, the exact same amount of compute units of RDNA 5, and you clock them exactly the same, on average in rasterization, what's the performance uplift? So no core increase, no clock speed increase, core to core. How much faster is RDNA 5 at rasterization before we talk about things like faster memory or faster clocks in the previous gen? Well, apparently that is at least 5 to 10%, and I could see it maybe getting to 15 to 20% if things go really, really well. Now, don't quote me on saying 15 to 20%, though. My quote is right now, AMD thinks they can get a 5 to 10% performance per clock uplift from RDNA 4 to RDNA 5. I just saw, at least in one document, they were going to try to get another 10% or something through further optimizations to the RDNA 5 architecture. And so I don't know if they managed to achieve that. But either way, the point is this. RDNA 5 seems like a bigger performance uplift per CU than RDNA 3 was over RDNA 2. But it's not the same like massive 40% uplift that we saw from RDNA 3 to RDNA 4. No, RDNA 5 is going to derive most of its performance increases by simply using less energy per compute unit at the same clocks, from what I can tell, and just being able to scale performance beyond 64 compute units easily to hundreds of compute units. It's like RDNA 1 to RDNA 2. It is not like RDNA 3 to RDNA 4, at least in terms of raster. Now, I still do not know the ray tracing uplift per compute unit of RDNA 5. I just simply know that it's a lot. And so we'll just have to see how that ends up panning out in that department. But certainly, I mean, if raster is at least around 10% or something, and then ray tracing ends up much more than that, then the average game, because many games do have some level of ray tracing now, would probably be above 10%, to be fair. But anyways, it's important to keep this per compute unit performance uplift for RDNA 5 in the back of your minds as I get to the PlayStation 6 specs, because, well, yeah, look, I'll say it. PlayStation 6 targets RDNA 5 for its architecture, and the specs are going to surprise some of you. But keep in mind that each compute unit for the PlayStation 6 is wildly faster than what's in the PS5, right? RDNA 5 is like 10% faster in raster than RDNA 4 per compute unit, and then RDNA 4 was 40% than RDNA 3, and RDNA 3 was like 7% or more for RDNA 2, and if we put in ray tracing, it's over double per compute unit, double the performance per compute unit, and so one RDNA 5 compute unit could be like 65% faster than an RDNA 2 one, and so the specs, they're not as weird as you might think, but anyways, I need to stop dancing around it and get to the leak for early plans for PlayStation 6 and PlayStation 6 handheld specs, but first, an ad from a sponsor. This piece of content is brought to you by CDkeyoffer.com. CDkeyoffer.com is really the best place to go to get reasonable pricing on Microsoft software, whether that's Windows 11 operating systems or Office products like the ones that I installed on this new Strix Halo laptop that I was testing while I made this ad. You see, I actually use CDkeyoffer.com. I've used them many times. My family members use them. My friends use them when they're building new PCs. And that's because they've been a reliable sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead for years now. And so if you're looking to get, say, a new laptop, or you just finally want to get a legitimate key of one of the latest Office products on your desktop during back to school, use CDkeyoffer.com's offer codes of Broken Silicon to save 25% on all Microsoft products. And then actually you can also use offer code DieShrink to save 3% on everything else on their website, like games as well. Once again, I want to thank CDkeyoffer.com for sponsoring this content, like all the other content that they've sponsored, and for making it easy for me to get a good price on Office on my new laptop. So, anyone remember the PlayStation 4? It was a console that made the choice to not go all out in specs so that it could have mass market appeal after the previous generation left some people feeling burned with how expensive it was at its launch. And I'll just say it, from what I've seen behind the scenes so far, it at least appears that Sony is planning to do this sort of a strategy again with the PlayStation 6. That's right, despite everyone out there seemingly speculating that the PlayStation 6 is going to be some $1,000 console or something, simply because the PS5 Pro wasn't cheap, that does not seem to be the route Sony is going this time around. No, the route Sony is going, from what I can tell, is to bring better than PS5 Pro performance to lower pricing tiers, and then to have a handheld APU that can sell as a direct Switch 2 competitor, while saving that die, I would assume also, to possibly use as a cheap S console, so that they can finally get the PlayStation 4 people that bought their consoles back in the day for $300 or $400, or maybe even sometimes less than either, to finally get them to upgrade that something that doesn't look wildly more expensive than what they are willing to pay. Now, having said that, another thing that I have to say before I get to the leak is that I actually went back and forth quite a bit on if I should show you all the documents I've seen or show any parts of them whatsoever. And I decided that the answer to that for this leak is no. I'm sorry, I think I've built up enough credibility with Sony being litigious against me and just putting out a full specs sheet from AMD on RDNA 5 recently that you can trust that everything I'm about to tell you comes directly from documents that came from some of my best sources at AMD. But the fact of the matter is, this is very, very sensitive stuff because it involves not just AMD, but one of their customers, one of their very litigious customers, Sony, but also this is data from a proposal AMD was making to Sony years ago. And so a lot of it has to be qualified with more modern documents I've looked at. And I feel like if I just shared old documents, not only would it be dangerous for my sources and myself, but I also think that it would be taken out of context. And so, yeah, I hope you see my dilemma. The point is, what I'm going to tell you is what AMD and Sony were planning to do before 2024, and I will tell you which things I've been able to verify have not changed since then, and which things I'm not sure if they have changed. But the point is, I think it's still very interesting because it tells us at least the idea for what Sony's going to do with the PlayStation 6 and the PlayStation 6 handheld, and the drive and the design goals seem very different from what people are speculating on right now. So anyways, without further ado, let's get into it. I have a couple slides to get to, and the first one I'm going to start with is the one for the PlayStation 6 home console, codenamed Orion. And actually, the first thing to say is the last bullet point on this slide, highlighted in red because it's very important. This info is from a 2023 AMD presentation to Sony. So some specs really might have changed by now, although I did consult with someone that's worked with Sony a lot in the past on their consoles, and this person told me that Sony tends to stick with what their initial ideas were. So while some of these specs have probably changed, I think the overall scope of what they're aiming to do is very unlikely to have changed since 2023. But anyway, something to call out here. Let's go from the start now. It had a chiplet design with some mention of it possibly utilizing a Navi 5 desktop chiplet. So this is important. The initial design in the PowerPoint looked almost kind of like an RDNA 3 design, except it was labeled Navi 5. I believe the initial version of RDNA 5 didn't look that different from RDNA 3, at least in how it was laid out. But of course, now we know from my recent leak about RDNA 5 that actually RDNA 5 is quite a bit different than RDNA 3. And even in this presentation, it was calling out some of these changes to RDNA 5 and that they wanted to convince Sony to use some of the desktop RDNA 5 chiplets in their console, just like they seemingly have successfully convinced Xbox. So I don't know if they've succeeded, right? I don't know if AMD succeeded in convincing Sony to use maybe the same AT2 graphics die as Xbox Magnus. By the way, if they did do that, wow, would that be great for economies of scale and probably drive down the cost of that desktop chip even more. But I don't know if they did, and I don't know if there's a bespoke die. Maybe there's an AT3 die. I've heard there is an AT3 at least, and maybe that's a smaller die for the PlayStation 6. I do not know. Just know that Sony is open to using chiplets, and AMD wanted them to use some of the chiplets they're going to use in desktop RDNA 5. Moving forward, call it out in the documents, something obvious. Yes, backwards compatibility to PS5 and PS4. No mention of PS3, unfortunately, guys. Sorry. Also, there is a heavy emphasis in multiple places on cost constraints and keeping power lower than the PS5. In fact, you can see it on screen here that it's targeting 160 watts of thermal board power. That's lower than what you got with the PS5. So this seems very important. Sony does not want the PS6 to cost more than the PS5 Pro. I don't believe so. Now, will they manage to make it $399 or $499? I doubt $399, but I think $499 is plausible. I do not believe this die is going to be very big at all. I believe Sony has been, since at least 2023, I should say, aiming to make the next generation make up for the fact that a lot of PS4 gamers were reluctant to upgrade. And let me continue with the specs then. 8 Zen 6 or later cores. Technically, they were just saying, oh, we're happy to use whatever the newest Zen core is. I believe that will be Zen 6 because, well, I'll get to it later. The handheld, I have newer documents that show that does use Zen 6, so that seems pretty much locked in. Also, this is what it said, guys, 40 to 48 RDNA 5 compute units. So, well, Sony wasn't sure what Zen architecture they wanted to use a couple years ago. They did know from the start they wanted to use RDNA 5, and we're probably working closely with AMD to make sure RDNA 5 specifically is great for the PlayStation 6, and also at 3 gigahertz or higher. So, well, that's less compute units than the PS5 Pro. Like if they go with 48 compute units, keep in mind that it will be clocked almost like 50% faster than the PS5 Pro, and that it will have like almost 65% or something more compared to this PS5 Pro, maybe 50% more performance per compute unit or something. So this will be faster than the PS5 Pro. Now, they also were considering a 160-bit or 192-bit bus with blazing fast GDDR7 and all different types of cache sizes. I'm not going to tell you what cache sizes they considered because, and some of it was called Infinity Cache because, again, I believe RDNA 5 has evolved into a different architecture from what they thought RDNA 5 would look like in the past. And so I don't really know what that means for the cache. Just know that they were not aiming for some 384-bit or 320-bit bus back then, and so I find it likely they'll probably go with 160 or 192, but I actually think they might stick with that. Certainly no bigger than 256-bit. And then there was a bar chart showing performance estimations for the PlayStation 6 in raster, not in ray tracing, in rasterization. They actually looked a lot like that 9070 XT leak I put out, by the way, which turned out to be correct. And they simulated that the PS6 should be around triple the performance of the PS5 in raster. Now, again, that's not ray tracing. In ray tracing, I would expect it to be, like probably 6-10 times faster in ray tracing. I think it would probably be at least that. So when you turn on ray tracing, the PS6 is going to look wildly better than the PS5. But I believe the 3 times raster thing is, that's about double what you get out of the PS5 Pro, depending on how you look at it. And they're thinking the PS5 Pro already kind of does 4K 120, more like 4K 90, 4K 80. And they're probably thinking, if we get to 4K 120, that's enough. After that, we just want to crank up ray tracing and not make this thing crazy expensive. Yes, one more thing to say here is that, 2 things actually. Number one is that I have a clear document that says when manufacturing is planned for, and that was mid-2027. And from everything I can gather behind the scenes and from public statements from Mark Cerny, actually, everything seems on track. So I know that it sounded like Mark Cerny said that this thing is years away, but technically 2027 is years away from 2025. And I'm just telling you, if you're mad at me for saying this is going to launch possibly in 2 to 2.5 years, that is what Sony and AMD's documents say it's going to do. That's when it's going to launch. So don't get mad at the messenger. That just seems like the plan, and I don't think that's that surprising because Sony tends to do 7-year generations. So anyways, though, one more thing. Because Canis, that is the handheld version of the PlayStation 6, I can verify from other documents that is on 3 nanometer using Zen 6, and Magnus is also on 3 nanometer. I believe that PlayStation Orion will also use a TSMC 3 nanometer node. But anyway, speaking of Canis, let us now get to the handheld leak. That's right. So PlayStation Canis, this is the PS6 handheld. It is going to use a monolithic 3 nanometer die. Again, I was able to verify this with modern documents. Okay. Now, also, it calls out backwards compatibility to PS5 and PS4. It also, in a diagram I saw, had support for a micro SD card slot, an M.2 SSD slot, haptic vibration, dual microphones, and a touchscreen. And specifically, when I did double check this, a diagram showed a USB-C port that could charge it fairly quickly, it looked like, but also had video out capabilities, meaning that it seems likely that the PS6 handheld will indeed be able to have like a USB-C to HDMI cable and plug into your TV, and you can just use that as a home console that's super portable. I'm excited about that idea, by the way. Again, same manufacturing and release date time frame, maybe launching a month after the PS6 home console, but roughly speaking, the same time frame. Also, targeting a 15-watt thermal board power. Now, that's important because I believe this would allow the PlayStation 6 handheld to fit into something like a GPD Win 4 package. So bigger than the PlayStation Vita, but smaller than a Nintendo Switch if they want it to be. So like a reasonably sized handheld. They're not aiming for those microwave-sized handhelds that have been announced all the time right now, like some of them going beyond 30 watts of power. They want this to actually be a handheld, and I was able to back this up. That's why it's in blue text here on multiple documents, some of them from this year. It seems to use 4 Zen 6C cores, and older documentation did call out 4 Zen C cores as well, but then also called out 12 to 20 RDNA 5 compute units at 1.6 to 2 gigahertz, a 128-bit bus with LPDDR5 X7500 or faster, and the rasterization performance, they simulated this as well. It was estimated to be about half the performance in raster as the PS5, but in ray tracing, probably higher than the PS5. So in other words, what does that mean for performance? Well, because it uses RDNA 5 and the Xbox Ally X uses 3.5, and because it should have a similar amount of compute units to the Xbox Ally X, but again, a better architecture, Canis should beat the Xbox Ally X in performance pretty easily, actually, considering it will use a more efficient operating system than Windows. But it doesn't seem like a powerhouse. It doesn't seem like this thing was built to crush the Xbox handheld. It just will because it's coming out later and uses newer stuff by the time it comes out. So I think Sony really is aiming for something here that is a handheld, is not insane. And to the people, by the way, that think that that performance isn't enough to run PS5 games, do not forget about the PS5 low power mode that I put out, with further analysis coming out in recent days suggesting that the low power mode for the PS5 may actually lower performance a ton, maybe cut it in half. And think about it. If PS5 low power mode cuts PS5 performance in half, well, we need benchmarks to confirm if it does something like that. But if it does, that's complete evidence, I believe, that Sony is putting in a flag for developers to program towards to support the PlayStation 6 handheld having backwards compatibility to PS5 and low power mode early. We'll have to wait for benchmarks in PS5 low power mode to confirm there is that much of a drop. But if there is, I feel very confident that this is, again, proof that lines up with today's leak as well. All right, so there you go. There's the PlayStation 6 home console and the PlayStation 6 handheld, or at least the specs that Sony was considering a couple years ago. What else is there to add? Well, I just one more time want to emphasize that I could see some of these specs getting an upgrade. It's been a couple years. Maybe Sony will see Xbox Magnus and go, we should just use AT2 as well, or we should beef up what's in AT3 or whatever our graphics chiplet uses. But, you know, I also think it's quite reasonable that they might not do that. And to everyone who thinks it's not, I don't think Sony's ever always been trying to win the specs race. I just think that they've happened to stumble into using a better design than what Microsoft put out multiple times, and that was never the end goal in and of itself. And that if you do market analysis right now, I just think that this next generation, like if Microsoft comes out, and I don't know what it will cost, maybe it'll be $500, but if Microsoft comes out and announces the next gen Xbox is like $800, I do not believe everyone's going to go, boy, I hope the PlayStation 6 is 1,000 so it's stronger. I think what they would do is if they saw Sony come out and be like, PS6, $500, stronger than PS5 Pro, they would start applauding in the streets because that's what people actually want. There's a ton of people that have not upgraded from PS4, and there's a lot of people dealing with economic problems right now. And I think this is actually the right time to launch a reasonably priced console, not one that pushes the specs to the limits. And frankly speaking, and this is a very important point, everybody, already we've kind of saturated 4K TVs. I mean, I can't tell you how many of my friends that aren't enthusiast PC gamers don't really care for more graphics than the PS5. I've asked several of them over the past week while I was working on this leak, and they're like, what? So what, the PS5 right now kind of does 4K 60, usually dynamic res below that. The PS5 Pro does 4K 60 for sure and kind of does 4K 90. And if this is like 50% to double the performance of the PS5 Pro, you're telling me this will just do 4K 120 locked, but with ray tracing cranked up? I don't need any more than that. And I don't know if anybody does, or really could even use it. Most people only have 4K 60 TVs, if that, at this point, and basically no one has a TV above 4K 120. So the performance that I'm leaking today, if Sony does end up sticking with it, I think it's enough to saturate a 4K 120 TV with ray tracing cranked up, and after that, it's going to be the stronger CPU, the new AI features I've heard Sony might be working on, that's going to make it feel next gen. It's not going to be because they can do 4K 160 instead of 4K 120. This isn't a PC. It's limited by the TVs people use, and the TVs most people use are 4K 120 or frankly 4K 60, and this will do that easily. And if stopping at the exact limit of what TVs are capable of right now gives you a $400 to $600 console instead of a $700 to $1,000 console, that makes total sense, in my opinion, for the next generation. And actually, speaking of price, that Canis APU, I really think that thing's going to be very, very small, very easy to cool, and cost substantially less to manufacture than the PS5 does right now. Meaning, well, if they can sell the PS5 for $400 right now, that I think it's entirely plausible that we could see like a PS6 home console that, yes, maybe is $500 to $600, maybe even $700. Probably not $700 though. I think $600 or less. And then we could see a handheld that is like $400 to $500, directly priced against the Switch 2, of course, with much better capabilities that can play PlayStation titles. And then below that, you remove the screen, you remove the battery, you just make it that much cheaper. It costs less to make than a PS5. You could have a Canis PlayStation 6S. I think it could be $299. Don't quote me on saying I'm sure of it, but if they can sell PS5s right now for $400, I'm telling you, Canis costs less to make. They could probably sell that for $350 or $300, and it will run stuff as well as well, it depends. Like the handheld will run it like PS5 low power mode, but depending on what clocks they can achieve in the PS6S, I think they could give you something that feels certainly a lot better than the PS4. Actually, though, speaking of PS4 and PS5, I do want to address the backwards compatibility thing a bit as well. So when I saw these specs, one of the first things that jumped out to me, I'm sure it's jumping out to a lot of you, is 48 compute units? That's not 60. 12, maybe 12 compute units in Canis at the minimum. That's not 18 compute units in the PS4 or 36 in the PS5. How will this have backwards compatibility with these different compute unit sizes? Well, I reached out to a couple Dame developers about this, and I said, do you think this would be an issue? In fact, I said, do you think it'll be an issue if Canis uses 4 Zen 6C cores? Will that have any issue running PS5 games? And both of them said no. In fact, one of them was allowed me to quote them, and they said this. They said, this is a game dev, actually wouldn't be concerned about backwards compatibility with these devices. See, RDNA 5 should be about 65% faster than RDNA 2 per compute unit. They agreed with my estimate. And Orion looks to be clocked 50% faster than the PS5 Pro. So overall, Orion easily has the performance to make up for having less compute units than the Pro, and thus I think it will have support for PS5 Pro optimized titles by default. As for Canis, that's also definitely enough to match PS5 low power mode, but obviously it might not be enough to have direct backwards compatibility to unpatched PS5 full power mode games, nor to PS5 Pro games, but PS6 will work because from the start, developers will know to make any PS6 game compatible with both versions of the console. By the way, and this is very important, this person wanted to make it clear that with PS5, Sony started using an updated API that has flags for many versions of the consoles, and PS4 just did not have that. That's why the PS4 Pro needed a butterfly design to 36 to double the compute units from PS4 for backwards compatibility. But if you will notice, the PS5 Pro did not need to double the amount of compute units from the base PS5. They can abstract performance more easily now since they have launched the PS5 with the more modern API. And so moving forward, actually, it's not quite as simple as Xbox being able to use almost any specs they want to try to get things to work with backwards compatibility, but it is a lot easier than it used to be for hardware backwards compatibility for Sony moving forward. And so the weird different specs, this person is not worried at all that 4 Zen 6 cores can match 8 Zen 2 cores. That'll be easy. In fact, this person was more worried about what it means for scaling performance between the PlayStation 6 home console to the handheld. But I don't think it's actually that weird because I believe that the PlayStation 6 home console is going to target 120 hertz gaming, and then the PlayStation handheld is going to target 60 hertz gaming. And because of that, big whoop, if the CPU is half the performance, whatever, it's probably going to be targeting half the frame rate. And so there you go. Apparently these specs that I've leaked today are not shocking any devs that I talked to. And in fact, one of them confirmed to me, I'm just letting you know this as well, that Sony apparently briefed their first-party developers on PlayStation 6 capabilities since the beginning of this year, meaning that the timeline I saw that said PlayStation 6 should be manufactured in the middle of 2027, they're still on target, and it seems like they really are likely to launch these consoles at the end of 2027 or possibly early 2028. To those who say, no way, it's too soon, it needs to be later, look, the people that said that about the PS4 were wrong. You had articles coming out saying it will be 2015 or whatever. It wasn't. Sony throws out some quotes. At the end of the day, the PS4 ended up launching 7 years after the PS3, and the PS5 ended up launching 7 years after the PS4. Sony does 7-year generations, and every time you guys, whenever I leak stuff about the PS5 or the PS5 Pro, people go, it's way too soon to launch the console, and then y'all frickin' buy it when it comes out anyways. because a lot of people, I believe, forget that when I say it's launching over 2 years from now, that's over 2 years from now. It's not coming out tomorrow, next month, next year, or even exactly the year after that. It is over 2 years away. And by then, I don't think it's ridiculous at all that Sony would have another console ready to go. In fact, based on the past 2 generations, it'd be weird if they didn't. And so, yeah, on that note, that is going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please, this requires an immense amount of work, not just by me, but by multiple people, talking to sources, verifying information online. Make sure you're subscribed to the Moore's Law Z YouTube channel to support us. Click on the links below for the sponsors. Like the video, share the video, and comment down below. I think this is a pretty big set of bombshells here. I bet a lot of you are going to have a lot to say, and I would like to see what you have to say in the comments. But also, I would like to hear what you have to say on the Moore's Law Z Discord. If you join the Patreon for just $2.56, you can do that. You'll also get access to hundreds of Die Shrink episodes. The most recent one is an interview with the Stop Killing Games creator, Ross. It's a very, very good episode that shows, really gets into like what we're trying to accomplish, or what he is trying to accomplish there with that movement. Of course, there's other interviews with developers that are exclusive to the Patreon, other videos as well. Please support us there to get all that, access to the Discord, and the ability to ask us questions on Broken Silicon as well. Next guest, by the way, will be James Pryor, someone who is in charge of segmentation at AMD, who wants to talk to me about what AMD's plans are for RDNA 5. You'll be able to ask James questions if you join the Patreon. But as you can see, I could barely finish that sentence because I'm getting very tired, so that should do it for this one. But at a minimum, if you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching.